Boy, what a difference it makes when I stand up straight. The last video I was hunched over. That was recorded just a couple minutes ago. I look a lot better sitting up straight. So guys, I'm starting this video just by noting, if you started watching my channel recently, you think of me as someone who studies Chinese, as the t-shirt indicates. But actually, back in my brilliant, focused, hardworking heyday as a young man, back when my energies were not so dissipated, back when I didn't have such a relaxed lifestyle, I studied the ancient Indian language, Pali. So my lifestyle's changed in a lot of ways. I'm now 40 years old. I have a 5-year-old daughter. I have a 26-year-old girlfriend who needs a lot of attention. She's just sitting off camera here. But there was a time when I was younger and much more mentally focused and self-disciplined. I was a real jerk, too. I was really hard to get along with. I was always saying to people, I'm not on vacation. Don't waste my time. I've got to get back to the Buddhist monastery. I've got to get back to the library. I've got to get back to the archives. I've got to get back to the gym. Did work out back then, too. But I studied the most ancient language of the Buddhist tradition. So it occurred to me, right after making the prior video talking about the nature of philosophy in the Western world, to do a video talking about the nature of philosophy in Buddhism, and thus in a large part of Asia. And I do now have expertise in Chinese and Japanese, but my original area of expertise in Buddhism was ancient India, Sri Lanka, and then the transition from Sri Lanka to Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, etc. So ancient Theravada Buddhism, but really all of the forms of Buddhism that follow after that. Although, like everyone else, I have relatively little interest in forms of Buddhism that are relatively corrupt and far removed from the original philosophy. There's that key word that started the whole thing rolling. So the question in the title of this video is Buddhism a philosophy? Was Buddhism ever a philosophy? And it's significant to note that from an early period in the European appraisal, there's been an interest in instead interpreting Buddhism as an anti-philosophy, interpreting Buddhism as a kind of nihilistic anti-creed or anti-religion. And this is sometimes done quite sincerely and sometimes with less sincerity. I would say this got popular first in the French language. It would be interesting to look at in Europe where this idea picked up first. But I can remember from the earliest period of the European interest in Buddhism, probably because at that time France was so Christian and the French imperialist encounter with Buddhism was so different from the British imperialist encounter. There was a lot of interest in looking at Buddhism not just as an antidote to Christianity, but as some kind of nihilistic or skeptical antidote to religion in general. In the English language, I would say this only really became popular in like the 1970s when the philosophy of Nagarjuna became very popular. Some people prefer to pronounce that name Nagarjuna. Whatever, knock yourself out. I mean, how we pronounce Sanskrit in 21st century English, it's a little bit flexible on these questions. Anyway, Nagarjuna is not the Buddha. Nagarjuna is a later Buddhist philosopher, but he became a kind of turning point in the Western reappraisal of early Buddhist philosophy as a negating critique of the religions that were older than Buddhism. Now, if you just look at it to that limited extent, so there are two negative contrasts here we're going to talk about in adumbrating the sense in which Buddhism is and isn't a philosophy. One is the extent to which Buddhism was proposed to challenge and negate the philosophies that came before it in ancient India. And we normally refer to those religions as Hinduism and Jainism, but they were significantly different from Hinduism as it exists today in India, significantly different from Jainism as it exists today in India also. So it was ancient Buddhism. It was season 1 Buddhism against season 1 Hinduism. It was a very different theater of debate, but we do have a lot of evidence of exactly what the debates were and the fact that it did indeed challenge. And then the second contrast is the extent to which Buddhism has emerged into modern Western consciousness, or even modern Asian consciousness, West and East, into modern appraisal as a challenge to religions like Christianity and Judaism. Oh, and Islam, sure, throw that in too. So Buddhism as a philosophy in this context gets a lot of credit for what it rejects, for what it expresses skepticism about, for what it expresses doubt about and the sophisticated way in which it challenges the assumptions of its interlocutors, the way in which it challenges the assumptions of Christians and ancient Hindus in these two contexts. So the best known example of this, and the example that has the most pages devoted to it in the Pali Canon, so the Pali Canon is the most ancient and most important corpus of Buddhist texts, is about the existence or non-existence of the soul. And please don't send me email on this. The word soul is a correct translation into English. It is not about the existence of the self. It's not about the bodily self. It's about the existence of the soul. It's not about the psychological personality. It's about whether or not you have a soul. That really is what's being debated there. And it really seems that pretty much everyone in ancient India, with the exception of people who were complete atheists, complete nihilists who rejected religion entirely, pretty much everyone seemed to agree that there was something called the soul. And they had debates about the nature of the soul and where it came from, where it went after you died. There's one theory, and I've had connections with the scholars who were interested in this. There's one theory that the most ancient idea of the soul in India was actually linked to the idea of the rain cycle, that when you died, your soul evaporated up into the heavens and rained down again. So just as in ancient Greece, there was a kind of speculative diversity of views about spirits and souls and even indeed cosmology and questions of where does rain come from, that there were different kind of supernatural approaches competing. And the Buddhists come in at the hard, skeptical, or nihilistic end of this, saying, no, there's absolutely no soul at all. And moreover, they think that there's this fundamental jarring improvement in your life if only you can deeply and profoundly appreciate that there really is no soul, if you'll give up this delusion. So this is one flattering example. Now, you could also look at any kind of specific religious austerity that the Buddhists were opposed to. For example, the idea that starving yourself to death brought about enlightenment, that fasting brought about enlightenment. The Buddhists are opposed to that. The idea that throwing yourself into freezing cold water, like in a ritual way, repeatedly, brought about enlightenment or spiritual attainment. So you get very catty sort of Buddhist debates about that. Like, well, if you think throwing yourself into freezing cold water makes you profound or philosophically advances you, you ought to get down on your knees and worship the fish that are swimming in this cold pond right now. They're much more enlightened than you or I. You know, this kind of thing. What's the significance of taking a vow of silence? What's the significance of starving yourself to death? There are a lot of specific... and a huge one. What's the significance of the Vedas, the ancient religious texts of Hinduism? And the Buddhists just think it's nonsense. The magical book that many other people in India, not all, are worshipping as their equivalent to the Bible. The Buddhists think that has no significance at all. So it's easy to cherry pick. It's easy to selectively quote these most critical passages of Buddhism. This is what a lot of people want to do, and then present Buddhism as a nihilistic anti-philosophy, as a liberating, skeptical ethic of cross-examining your opponents and revealing the truth. Now, this is itself, however, completely fictional, because what you're doing is only looking at less than one half of what the religion is. Buddhism, ancient Buddhism in the ancient world, absolutely was based on hallucinogenic experiences. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say on hallucinations, period. I shouldn't say hallucinogenic. Hallucinations, period. And of hallucinating and seeing all kinds of things, including gods with a lowercase g, and yetis, and demons, and the ghosts of deceased people, and the fate of what happens to the ghosts of those deceased people after they die, and that they go through a kind of magical process of reincarnation and other spirit realms and so on. So all of that is fundamentally dogmatic and magical. And it's only by focusing on one half of the equation that Europeans and also modern people in Asia tried to rehabilitate Buddhism by focusing on its most skeptical aspects, even though those aspects are there. Now, even if we just stuck to, say two issues within ancient Buddhism, the soul, i.e. the fact that ancient Buddhism rejected the soul, and the concept of fate, the concept of the gods controlling your fate, Buddhism also rejects that, the idea of the gods determining or any kind of fixed fate. Destiny. That's a good way to put it. The issue of destiny. If you just think about those two issues, you already have two really big wedge issues that make Buddhism seem very enlightened and modern compared to Christianity. Now let's bring this back down to earth for a second here. How about sex? As recently as the 1960s, but even more so in the 1860s, you could have traveled to Thailand and said, wow, everyone here is kind of fundamentally down to earth and relaxed about sex. They're relaxed about homosexuality. They're relaxed about transgender and cross-dressing people. They don't seem to have the attitudes towards virginity and marriage that we have in the Western world. Compared to what was normal in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the types of social customs and attitudes towards sex that had emerged out of Buddhism, on the one hand, it did valorize monks living in total celibacy. But there's kind of a very simple division between, on the one hand, there's the life of celibacy, and on the other hand, there's this life of sexual freedom of lay people. It's like monks completely reject using money. They're not supposed to even touch money. But if you're a layperson, fine, go out and earn as much money as you want to. There's a similar kind of black and white difference between the monastic life, which is totally virtuous, world rejecting, and then there's the worldly realm, life affirming, and it's not quite no holds barred. It's not quite a free for all, but much more permissive. Again, even in the 1960s, let alone the 1860s, than what Europeans were saddled with. So again, there's this tendency to want to interpret Buddhism as a kind of liberating nihilistic ethic, as an anti-philosophy and an anti-religion, as removing chains. So, again, my point isn't that this is totally false or totally false. You can see why people got excited. People were really optimistic. But this is less than half of the whole story. Just as when people stand up and say about the American Constitution and the formation of the United States of America, this is some great liberating thing about the whole world, you can kind of put your hand up and say, what about the slaves and the native people? Like, what about indigenous people and slaves? What about slavery and genocide, to put it that way? Like, there are some big gaps in, the good news about the American Constitution. It doesn't mean there's nothing to be excited about or nothing to appreciate in the American Constitution, but there are some really big questions left here. And with Buddhism, I mean, just the issue of slavery, the issue of imperialism and kingship, the issue of government, the issue of what kind of government was associated with and promoted by Buddhism. And I mean, again, most Buddhist scholars are still shocked when I even mention slavery. It's like, well, guess what, guys? This was a huge part of the religion right up till the day before yesterday. There's a lot that's being swept under the rug there. In Southeast Asia especially, it's true also that Buddhism was very positively related to literacy as such. So it kind of gets it gets a lot of good press, gets a free ride that way, it's a very positive thing. Buddhism was really the source of written language in Southeast Asia, and it provided literacy. It taught literacy to both, men and women. So I give credit for that, and I could get into even the technical details of how literacy was spread to people through Buddhist monks. Buddhist monks were really the only teachers, the only professional teachers, professional educators in a society that was really totally illiterate before Theravada Buddhism arrived there. And Buddhist temples, even in Laos, even in the mountains of Laos, they became engines of literacy and warehouses of common literature, and there's a lot positive that came out of that. However, these societies did not progress scientifically. They didn't. I mean, and we don't even have to say compared to England and France. They did not progress scientifically even compared to China or Japan or India. They never even really caught up with India. They never built the pyramids. They never caught up with ancient Egypt. They never accomplished anything on that scale. They very fundamentally remained mired in a kind of worse than feudal ignorance. And why is that? Well, again, obviously, I'm not saying that Buddhism alone should be criticized this way. Most people who are sincerely engaged in the study of the history of Islam, they look at the dark ages that Islam brought about as this terrible regression. If you just look at ancient Athens, the pagan period of ancient Athens, compared to the dark ages once Catholicism takes over, you see a kind of regression there also. Many religions have kind of blotted out the human capacity for innovation, imagination, learning, etc., etc. But with those religions, with Islam and Catholicism, it's kind of easy to point to repression as the problem. And with Theravada Buddhism, really just want to talk about Theravada Buddhism at this moment. So I think this is true. Well, this would also be true of many other forms of Buddhism. But let's just say with Theravada Buddhism, it's not so much that you see repression that's there, in the sense of Islam brutally conquering a country, forcing all of the men to be circumcised as adults, smashing their idols, burning down their temples, stealing all the gold from the temples, and then forcibly assimilating everyone in cultural genocide on a massive scale. This is how Islam conquered a large part of the world. It's not that. What's disturbing, the lesson we have to take from the lack of progress in Buddhist societies, is just how fundamentally satisfying the myth of reincarnation is to people. That a great deal of the edge, death loses its sting, and life loses its lash and its motivation when you see yourself not as an individual living one life who's got to accomplish something now. It's now or never. You're going to die and you never come back. You got one life, you're in and you're out. As opposed to, oh, no, it's a cycle of suffering. It's a cycle of reincarnation of lives that come and go again and again over thousands and thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. This is a cycle that goes on almost forever. One of my professors of Buddhism used to say it's infinity minus one, the cycle of worlds. But you've been reincarnated innumerable times before, and you will be reincarnated innumerable times again. And this may motivate certain kinds of suicidal and self-destructive virtue. It may make people more willing to sacrifice their lives. And it also demotivates certain kinds of accomplishment, certain kinds of world-changing, life-changing, paradigm-challenging activities in one's life. So I close this video by saying, I'm now 40 years old. And I'm trying to plan what I'm going to do between age 40 and age 60. I'm never going to be 40 years old again. The mental, intellectual, and creative potential I've got now, I don't think I'm going to have it at 60. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm going to go be a Renaissance man at 60 and 70. I don't know. But there's no doubt the kind of motivation I've felt many times in my life, thinking I might only have a few years to live. I've got to live now. I've got to do this now. The intense focus and work ethic I have. I think that can emerge out of nihilism or atheism or many different views of the world. But there is something mentally deadening about spirituality, put it that broadly. When people think they're not living for today, they're not living for now, they're not living for the next 20 years. You're living for an eternity in paradise, in Christianity, it's those religions, or you're living for an almost eternal cycle of reincarnation. I think this really has a tremendously deadening impact on the human spirit. It robs death of its sting, but it may also rob life of its savor. Buddhism. A mix of dogma, philosophy, and anti-philosophy. I will put the link to my Buddhism playlist at the bottom of this video. Shout out to the one supporter on Patreon, one, who asked me to make more videos about Buddhist philosophy.